Hello and welcome to this video on how industry brews beer. Have you ever wondered how companies can make beer the way they do? Are there giant vats of beer fermenting away, just like a home brewer, but larger? Can they streamline this process? If they do, how? The answer to all of these is a sort of yes. Industrial brewing still relies on a process similar to home and craft brewing. They rely on giant vats of thousands of litres. Inside these vats, they ferment your sugars, malt, dextrose, and so on. The reason we say sort of yes to everything else is that what they ferment in the vats is somewhat different. In order to reduce costs, difficulty, and increase profit margins, industrial brewers need to be more efficient. This efficiency is achieved through something called high-gravity brewing. The fundamental principle behind high-gravity brewing is surprisingly simple. You create a wort that has an original gravity much higher than you would normally have. That is significantly more than is needed to achieve the final gravity and alcohol concentration, before you then dilute it with water. It is far and away easier to dilute beer after brewing to save time, resources, and increase production if all you have to do is add water to a bottle. This can explain the diluted piss they call beer at times. Under normal circumstances, you're after a specific gravity that in industry terms is called Plato. Plato has the same basic definition as specific gravity, the amount of solids dissolved in a liquid. The industry range is typically 10 to 13%. That's going to get you a 4 to 6% alcohol by volume. If you're looking at high gravity brewing, you take this value and you increase it. It goes from 10 to 13 Plato to 14 to 17 degrees Plato. You get a consequential increase in the alcohol content, shifting from 4 to 6% alcohol to 6 to 8% alcohol. As we've mentioned, this is going to be one reason why they do it. They can dilute this down to your 4 to 6% alcohol standard. That gets more beer out of less brewing. The second reason is efficiency. If you can make a single vat of beer, then dilute that vat into the equivalent of 2, you've not only doubled your production, but you've decreased the amount of facilities required and the amount of time that's been used to ferment it. This is somewhat necessary in large-scale industrial brewing. There's a very high production demand and often limited facilities. Think of it almost as a concentrate or a cordial being generated that can then be diluted down. By adding deoxygenated water to this high alcohol beer, they reduce the alcohol concentration, which in some countries is also taxed. This means they not only get the volume of beer desired, but they increase their production and possibly decrease their overheads. This information is useful for home brewing, but it's also inspired by earlier and established beer styles. We've mentioned the two big reasons for high gravity brewing. One is the alcohol content, and the second is to increase volume. At least regarding the high alcohol content, there are clear and established beer styles that have that. Your German Bock, Belgian Triple, or British Barley Wine. All of these have a very high alcohol content, which is largely achieved by having a very high original gravity. Conversely, because there's not a very large demand for these beer styles by comparison to others, they are not produced in the same industrial quantities as other styles. If you're looking at using this sort of information to help your own brewing, you can think about it as a way to increase the amount of flavour. By adding more fermentables, more hops, and not watering it down, you get a stronger, more potent beer, and it's one way you can apply this high-gravity brewing principle. It's also one of the reasons why high gravity has a rather poor reputation. Those who use it tend to then water down their beer. A crime if nothing else, depending on how you want to look at this. If you are looking at doing high gravity brewing, you may want to consider watering it down though, and that owes to several things. We've mentioned that it produces very strong flavours, sometimes very striking flavours that can be unpleasant for some people. You obviously don't need to do what an industrial brewery does and dilute it down at a 1-to-1 ratio. That is, you're not going to be doubling your production, but you might find that 20% water added to it might help to improve that balance just a little bit. The other advantages to high gravity brewing are that you don't need any extra equipment. The techniques, the yeast, everything is the same. You're just using more of your raw ingredients. This is one of the key benefits to high gravity brewing. You don't need anything more than what you were already going to be using in the first place, and you may be freeing up equipment that can be used for other fermentations instead. In order to make use of this in more detail, you can take a few different approaches. One is, as said, brew a stronger, more concentrated beer, and then dilute it down by a little bit. For the most part, most people won't notice a fractional dilution. We're talking 10 to 20% here. More than that, and if you know what you're drinking, you'll begin to notice something that's a little bit off. Alternatively, if you are doing an entirely high gravity brewing and you plan this from the start, you can adjust the recipe to account for this dilution factor, which means what you're drinking in the end should be exactly the same as though you hadn't diluted it at all, simply because you increase the concentration of everything at a proper ratio for it. Another reason to consider that is simply the fact that high gravity brewing will produce a high alcohol beer. This is not to everyone's taste, and in some cases, simply unnecessary. Going beyond 5 to 6% alcohol generally isn't necessary. Some beers either have it as a part of their style or necessary for some of the flavours. Pushing it much beyond 8 to 10% in most instances isn't necessary, and there are some examples of very potent beer out there that goes well and truly into the alcohol concentrations of a spirit. Looking at this at a much more realistic and common level, if you have a beer that comes out somewhere between 7 to 10%, you may want to dilute this down to somewhere closer to 5 to 6%, perhaps even lower. That will give you both a larger beer quantity and also a more tolerable alcohol concentration. If you do not dilute it for the purposes of reducing the alcohol volume, you can do so to deal with other things like bitterness, colour, some of the flavours that aren't quite in the right way. If you want to make the beer drinkable, and this is a good way to deal with some of the beer batches that haven't gone quite to plan, you can dilute it. And it occurs at a roughly direct relationship between the original amount and the final amount. This has been a very broad and simple summary of high gravity brewing, why it's used in industry, and how it can be used by the home brewer. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.